As the MC raised the microphone and asked the guests to fill their glasses, Laura Hayes felt a sudden tightness in her chest. She sat at a round table by the window of a banquet hall in suburban Seattle, watching the lights reflect off the glass as if the city beyond were a separate reality she couldn't access. Her mother stood at the center table, beautiful and excited, in an ivory dress. Next to her stood her new husband, David, and a little further away stood Emily, his daughter. "And before we continue the celebration," her mother said, smiling so broadly that Laura's eyes hurt, "I want to thank one special person. Someone without whom this day simply wouldn't exist." Laura instinctively sat up. Her heart leaped, and her palms became clammy. She hadn't expected a confession, but she still hoped, foolishly, naively, that her mother would at least look at her a little longer than usual. "Emily," Mom continued, and the room erupted in applause. Laura seemed deafened. The noise, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, everything became muffled and distant. Emily stood up, smiling modestly, as if it were her graduation ceremony and not someone else's wedding. She bowed her head slightly, accepting the applause, and for a second their gazes met. Something akin to satisfaction flickered in Emily's eyes. Laura was 28. She had always considered herself and her mother to have a strong bond. After the divorce, they had lived together for a long time, sharing evenings watching TV, late-night conversations in the kitchen, and a habit of drinking too strong coffee on weekends. Everything changed 2 years ago, when David came into Mom's life. And with him, Emily, younger, brighter, louder, and seemingly fitting perfectly into the new version of Mom's life. This wedding was supposed to be Laura's chance to recoup at least some of what she'd lost. That's why she took on the planning when her mother wearily said, "I don't want to get bogged down in all these details. Do it yourself, okay?"
Surprise me?
Laura agreed without hesitation. She wasn't just organizing a celebration, she was investing hope in it. The last few months had been a grind. Working during the day, calling contractors in the evening, sifting through expense spreadsheets at night. She was looking for a venue when her first option fell through. Negotiating with a caterer when it turned out half the guests had allergies. She changed florists because the roses her mother wanted suddenly doubled in price. She paid for it herself, postponing a car purchase, canceling vacations, convincing herself it was all worth it. Mom hardly asked anything. Not once did she inquire about how things were going. At the time, Laura thought it was trust. Now it was indifference. A few weeks before the wedding, she overheard a conversation in the living room. Mom and Emily were laughing, discussing something while Laura sat in the next room with her laptop. "I couldn't have done it without you," Mom said. "You're so on top of everything." "Oh, come on," Emily replied. "I actually like it. Organizing is my thing." Laura then closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time, convincing herself that she'd misunderstood. That maybe Emily was just helping with advice. That Mom couldn't dismiss her contribution so easily. Now, at the banquet, there was no longer any doubt. The applause died down. The MC continued the program, the music grew louder, and the guests returned to their conversations. Laura forced herself to smile and take a sip of champagne. The wine tasted sour. Or maybe it was just the bitter taste in her mouth. She looked at her mother, laughing next to Emily, and for the first time in a long time, she clearly understood. This celebration was no longer about family, not about intimacy, not about the love she had tried so hard to earn. This was a celebration where there was no place for her. And somewhere deep inside, beneath a layer of resentment and fatigue, a thought began to form that made her feel both terrified and relieved. Perhaps silence was no longer an option. After the wedding, Seattle seemed especially gray to Laura. Even the rare sunny days brought no joy. The city seemed to have faded along with her mood. A week passed, then a second, and something inside her was still clinging. Every time her phone vibrated, Laura caught herself hoping it was her mother. But more often it was colleagues or friends, while her mother sent short, cautious messages, as if an invisible wall had risen between them. She replayed that evening over and over again. The applause. Emily's smile. The pride in her mother's eyes, but not for her. The pain wasn't sharp, but tugging, exhausting, as if something inside her was being slowly wrenched apart. 10 days later, her mother returned from her honeymoon. Laura hesitated for a long time about going to see her, but eventually realized that if she kept quiet now, she'd be stuck with it forever. On Saturday morning, she got in the car and drove to Bellevue, where her mother was now living with David. Mom opened the door in a dressing gown, tanned, and with a relaxed smile. "Laura," she said, surprised. "You could have told me." "We need to talk," Laura replied, startled by how harsh she sounded. They walked into the living room. The suitcases were still leaning against the wall. Souvenirs lay on the table. It was as if Mom's life had been perfectly arranged, and Laura had no place in it. "What happened?" Mom asked, frowning. "Are you angry about the wedding?" "Not about the wedding," Laura clasped her hands. "It's about what you said, about blaming Emily for all the organizing." Mom's face changed. The smile vanished. Her gaze grew cold. "So," she said, "Emily really helped me a lot." "She didn't help," Laura snapped. "I did everything. I found the venue. I paid the contractors. I solved the problems. Did you ever even ask how things were going?" Mom chuckled, and it hurt more than a scream. "Laura, you were the one who suggested doing this. But if you'd really been involved, I wouldn't have had to rely on Emily. She was there, she was interested, she was worried." "Because she lied to you," Laura's voice wavered. "She let you think she was doing everything." "Stop," Mom interrupted. "I don't like that tone. It sounds like jealousy." Laura felt something inside her snap. "Jealousy," she repeated. "I'm telling you the truth, and you call it jealousy?" "You've always been too sensitive," Mom said. "Emily's just more mature. More reliable." These words struck the final nail. Laura stood up. "Okay," she said quietly. "If you don't want to hear the truth, I'll leave." "I guess it's best this way," Mom replied, turning away. The door closed behind Laura, too loudly. That same evening, she went to Emily's. The decision had come suddenly, but it seemed the only right one. Emily lived in a modern house in the city center, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a minimalist interior. She opened the door with that same flawless smile. "Oh, Laura," she drawled. "What a surprise." "Stop it," Laura said, walking inside. "Why did you do that?" "Did what?" Emily shrugged. "You know perfectly well. You let my mother believe you organized her wedding." Emily sighed and sat down on the sofa. "I didn't allow anything. She decided it herself." "And you didn't correct her." Laura leaned forward. "It was for your own benefit." Emily chuckled. "Has it ever occurred to you that if you were more open, more visible, she would understand? People trust those who are close to them." "You stole my work," Laura said. "And you ruined my relationship with my mother." "Don't be dramatic," Emily replied calmly. "It's just a wedding." Laura looked at her and suddenly realized Emily didn't regret anything. For her, it was a game she'd simply won. "It's not over yet," Laura said, heading for the door. "Do whatever you want," Emily called after her. "Just don't play the victim." Laura didn't sleep that night. A folder of documents lay on the table, contracts, receipts, correspondence. She'd been gathering them mechanically, even before her conversation with her mother, as if subconsciously preparing for this moment. Now she had no doubts left. If the truth didn't want to be heard quietly, it would have to be spoken loudly. Laura knew Emily's birthday by heart, though she'd rather forget it. They were planning to celebrate at David and her mother's house, a spacious two-story cottage in the Seattle suburbs. Laura, of course, wasn't invited. After their argument, her mother had limited herself to dry messages, and she never mentioned Emily again, as if an awkward silence had formed between them that no one dared fill. That morning, Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder in front of her. Inside, neatly arranged were contracts with contractors, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, letters from florists and coordinators. She hadn't collected them for revenge. At least, that's what she told herself. Rather, it was to restore justice. For herself. She hesitated for a long time. Part of her wanted to simply close this chapter, let it go, and move on. But every time she imagined Emily again accepting compliments for someone else's work, her insides clenched. Silence no longer felt noble. It had become a betrayal of herself. By evening, Laura was driving down a familiar street. The lights were on outside the house, cars were parked in the yard, and laughter and music drifted from the open windows. She stopped, took a deep breath, and picked up the folder. Her hands were shaking, but her steps were confident. David opened the door. He looked surprised but stepped aside. "Laura? You come in." The living room was crowded. Emily's friends, relatives, her mother sat on the couch with a glass of wine. Emily stood in the center of the room, accepting congratulations. When she saw Laura, her smile froze for a second. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly, coming closer. "I'm telling the truth," Laura replied and stepped forward. The music continued, but the conversations gradually died down. Laura felt dozens of eyes turn to her. "I'm sorry," she said loudly. "I didn't mean to ruin the celebration. But I can't stay silent any longer." Mom looked up. "Laura, please." "No," Laura said calmly but firmly. "You need to hear this. You all need to." She opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "I organized my mother's wedding. Completely. I paid for the hall, the catering, the decor, the florists. Here's the contract with the venue. Here are the invoices. Here's the correspondence with the coordinator." Silence fell over the room. Emily turned pale. "You're exaggerating," she tried to smile. "I was just helping." "You lied," Laura interrupted. "And you let everyone think you did it." "Emily?" A voice came from the corner. It was her boyfriend, Nathan. "Is that true?" Emily hesitated. "I didn't think it was important." "It was important to me," Laura said, looking directly at her mother. "I wanted to be there for you. I wanted you to be proud of me. And you believed what others said without even asking me." Mom stood up, her eyes filling with tears. "Laura, I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Laura replied more softly. "And that's what hurts the most." Nathan took a step back from Emily. "If you could lie about this," he said, "I'm not sure I know you." "Wait," Emily began, but he was already shaking his head. "I need to go." He grabbed his jacket and left. A murmur spread through the room. Emily sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Laura felt a strange calm. She had said everything she needed to say. "I didn't come for an apology," she said finally. "I came for the truth." She closed the folder and headed for the door. Mom took a step toward her. "Please, talk later?" Laura nodded, but made no promises. When she stepped outside, the air felt surprisingly fresh. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the heaviness in her chest. The truth no longer belonged solely to her. And that was enough. A few weeks passed after Emily's birthday, and Laura's life began to change slowly, but noticeably. Not abruptly, not like in the movies, no grand gestures or instant reconciliations. More like after a long illness. The weakness remained, but breathing became easier. Mom called first. Laura saw her name on the screen and hesitated for a long time. The resentment still lingered inside her, but it was no longer searing, but warm and tired. She pressed the button. "Laura." Mom's voice was quiet, unusually hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot. About us. About what happened." Laura remained silent, letting her speak. "I was wrong," Mom continued. "I didn't listen to you. I believed my own version of events and pushed you away when you wanted to be with me most of all. I have no excuse." Laura had been waiting for these words, but when they came, tears still welled up. It hurt me so much, she said honestly. Not because of the wedding, but because you chose not to believe me. I know, Mom replied. And I understand that I'm sorry isn't enough. I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I just want a chance to make things right. If you're ready. Laura closed her eyes. She felt no triumph, only weariness and a strange calm. We need time, she said. And new rules. I won't prove my worth through sacrifice anymore. I accept it, Mom said quietly. Really? They began communicating cautiously. Short calls, rare meetings in cafes. No pressure, no expectations. And in this new format, Laura felt respect for the first time, for her boundaries, her time, her life. Emily was rarely mentioned, but Laura knew her world was crumbling. Friends began to keep their distance. Compliments gave way to awkward silence. She was no longer the center of attention. And although Laura held no gloating, pity arose naturally. Not for the lies, but for the emptiness they left behind. For the first time in a long time, Laura focused on herself. She returned to drawing, which she had abandoned many years ago. She met up with friends on weekends, not canceling plans because of other people's requests. She enrolled in a course she had long dreamed of. And, most unexpectedly, she began to feel confident without external approval. She no longer sought recognition from others. She knew the value of her work, her care, her love. And this knowledge was enough. One evening, sitting by her apartment window and looking out at the lights of Seattle at night, Laura realized she was no longer replaying the past. It was no longer an anchor. It had become an experience. The truth had come out. The masks had fallen. Relationships had changed. But in its place, something more valuable had emerged: self-respect. Sometimes losses are needed not to punish, but to make room for a new, more honest life. And Laura was ready to move on.